Enjoy the taste of summer no matter what the weather when you head to Maverick for some Mountain Dew Baja Blast. You'll love the legendary, refreshing tropical lime flavor. And to make the sweetness last longer, Maverick now has it in 1-liter bottles. For a limited time, get 2 for $5. Single purchase regular price. Plus, Adventure Club members get 25 bonus trail points with purchase. So blast into Maverick today and enjoy that unmistakable Baja flavor. Maverick. Adventure's first stop.
State Farm and DJ Dramos from Life as a Gringo know making smarter financial moves today secures your financial freedom for a successful tomorrow.
Now we have a level of privilege that our parents never had. So what do we do with it, right? How do we utilize the opportunities that we have that they don't, right? And a lot of that is educating ourselves on how to not make the same mistakes they did.
Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. State Farm, proud sponsor of My Cultura Podcast Network.
It's just about a month away. I'm going to be at the Berkshire Podcast Festival in North Adams, Massachusetts at the height of leaf peeping season. This event has so many great podcasters coming, including the Generation Y, Lucy from Wine and Crime, Laura with The Only One in the Room, and so many more, including me, of course. And I will be doing a panel about what it's like to work in the true crime genre. Because the organizers understand it can be a little bit more expensive if you're traveling last minute like this, they are actually offering a late bird discount, a 20% off discount on tickets. Go to BerkshirePodcastFestival.com, use the code FALLINTOTHESOUND. I'll leave all of this in the show notes, and get your tickets now. It is going to be an amazing event. It's an intimate event. You get time to actually hang out with all of the podcasters who are going to be there. And let me know if you're coming so that I can make sure we connect. So hopefully I'll see you there. In the late 1990s, Belinda Temple could feel that her marriage was falling apart. But during a brief reconciliation, she got pregnant again and decided to do her best to hold the family together. But according to the police, that's not what everyone wanted to happen. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome. Here we are with another two-parter. I will probably have the second part done early, like I always try to do. I don't want to make you wait a week for the next episode. So you may only have to wait a few days for it. We'll see how it goes. This case was recommended by Barbara. It's taken me so long to get to this that I don't even know if you listen anymore, but thank you for sending the suggestion over. And speaking of listener suggestions, a retroactive shout out to Jonathan for recommending last week's case. I somehow forgot to transfer that note over from my note-taking document into my final script. For those who have recently emailed me case suggestions, I am working on getting those added. I've seen everybody's emails. I am just behind on responding, and that is on my September catch-up to-do list. The upside of it taking me a while to get to this particular case is that although it happened in 1999, it wasn't resolved until 2023. So had I covered it earlier, we would already need an update. Let's get started with Belinda Lucas, who was born in December of 1968. Belinda's parents, Tom and Carol, already had 3 boys. And so when Carol found out she was expecting for the 4th time, they assumed it was going to be another boy. I know this feeling since I had 3 boys before my daughter was born, but I had the benefit of an ultrasound to let me know ahead of time what to expect. Tom and Carol didn't have that, so they were pleasantly surprised when Carol delivered a healthy baby girl. Carol got to use the girl's name she had picked out, Brenda, but then shortly after Brenda was born, the doctor started palpating Carol's abdomen and let her know there was an extra surprise. She was pregnant with twins, and that is when Belinda was born. Carol had spent years hoping for a daughter, and then all at once she had 2 of them. Belinda had a pretty traditional upbringing, and she went to college to become a teacher. She went to Stephen F. Austin University, which is in Nacogdoches, Texas, and her major, of course, was education. It was while she was there that she met a fellow student named David Temple. David grew up in Katy, Texas, outside of Houston, and he was the middle of 3 boys. In high school, David was a star football player in town, and then he got a scholarship to play for the university. And when you hear about someone being a star football player in a town like Katy, Texas, you kind of expect to hear that life was sunshine and roses for them. For my listeners not in the U.S., Texas is known for its football culture. There is a reason Varsity Blues and Friday Night Lights take place in Texas. But even within the state of Texas, Katy is known for taking high school football very seriously. So you would think it would be smooth sailing for a big athletic guy like David, but he ended up finding himself in trouble in his teen years. Finding himself in trouble is a passive way to say it. I should say that he put himself into these situations. He had a temper, which led to fights, and he has been accused of being a bully in high school. He also got arrested. He and a friend had been breaking into cars, and this led to a few days in jail and a fine. According to Catherine Casey's book on this case called Shattered, which will be linked in my sources, which are always linked in my description box, the person David was arrested with said they were stealing things to pay for steroids. If that's true, and David was using anabolic steroids, that may account for some of his anger and aggression issues as a teen. Issues that continued into his college years, where he was also known for getting into fights. But it seems like David may have been moving past all of this when he and Belinda got married. There is no evidence he was physically abusive to her while they were dating, and they were dating for about a year before he proposed at the 50-yard line. She said yes, and the two married in 1992. They had finished their undergrad degrees, but stayed at the school a little longer to get their master's in education, and then they moved an hour south to Livingston, Texas, so David could take a teaching and coaching position. It wasn't long before jobs became available for them near David's hometown of Katy, so they packed up and moved again. David became a high school physical education teacher and an assistant football coach, while Belinda was teaching special education, first at the middle school, and she was also coaching volleyball. David's family, the Temple family, were very close-knit, and Belinda jumped right into family life with them. Unfortunately, this did not go both ways. While David was always polite to Belinda's family, at least to their faces, he was more standoffish with them. He didn't really visit often, and Belinda would tell her friends that he didn't always want her to go visit her family either. According to what David and Belinda's friends said later, David grew to look down on Belinda's family. He called them fat, crazy, and white trash. As a result, they spent most of their holidays with David's family at his insistence. And Belinda, who was so bold and outspoken in other areas of her life, would acquiesce to what David wanted. This seemed to get worse after their son Evan was born in April of 1995, a few years into their marriage. David didn't want her taking their son to see her family either, so she would generally only go when David was busy or out of town. David was busy often since he taught full-time and then he coached after school. Belinda, however, cut back on her hours after Evan was born. She applied for a teaching job that did not require coaching and was hired as a special education teacher at Katy High School. This meant that she could leave school every day and go straight to the daycare to pick Evan up. And no matter how tired she was, she would always take him outside to play and enjoy that time together. Even with David's busy schedule, particularly during football season, he was also a very hands-on parent. He doted on his son, he was protective of him, and sometimes that even caused conflict between him and Belinda if they disagreed on something like discipline. When some of Belinda's friends would look back, this time period where their son was a toddler was when the cracks in the Temple marriage started showing to the outside world. After football season in the fall of 1996, David ended up not being home more often like Belinda expected. He would still go out after school, often to happy hours with coworkers, and Belinda believed him when he said he was just out at a bar, or maybe he said he got tied up at work. But that was until she started seeing credit card slips that showed David wasn't necessarily where he said he was, and sometimes when he'd say he was in one place, he was actually somewhere like a strip club. Belinda was working full-time, doing the bulk of the housework, and some neighbors said she also did all the yard work, and she was taking care of their son, while David seemed to just be doing what he wanted. I do want to be clear, because we're a both sides kind of podcast here, that this is not the point of view and the perspective of everyone who knew Belinda and David. This is just one perspective shared by a handful of friends. Belinda and David also had other friends and even family members who thought they had a near-perfect marriage. I will say this is not uncommon. Not all of our friends get to see every side of us. And sometimes family actually knows less than friends because we really do try to shield them from some of the more unpleasant things. Like Belinda didn't tell her family what David was saying about them, but her closest friends did know. A lot of the negative things that have come out about David and Belinda's marriage have come from friends who said they heard it from Belinda, but also people who said they witnessed it themselves. Things like David calling Belinda fat shortly after she gave birth to their son. These were friends who saw the usually strong-willed Belinda go quiet and accept whatever David did or said. Fast forward a year to the summer of 1998, and it really looked like they may be heading towards divorce. Belinda told a friend that she and David had stopped talking. They went about 6 weeks without speaking to each other while living in the same house. Then one night, Belinda just asked David straight out if he loved her. According to Belinda's friend Tammy, Belinda was devastated when the answer was, "I don't know." But by the next night, David seemed to have thought about it, and he told Belinda that he did love her. And that started a reconciliation between the two. It was during that period that Belinda got pregnant again, and at her 20-week ultrasound, they found out that they were having a girl. At first, David seemed as excited as Belinda about the baby coming, and they chose the name Aaron Ashley. But soon football season started up and he was busy again. And then on the nights he had free, he would go out for a happy hour with coworkers. Belinda was a little frustrated that she was having to get the nursery set up mostly on her own, but that was just really a small complaint in comparison to what was really going on behind her back. One of the coworkers David was going out with after work was a newly hired 9th grade English teacher named Heather Scott. And David really liked her. There is a lot of commentary on this case that highlights Heather's looks, with people literally debating if she was hot or not, and some comparing her looks to Belinda's. But let me just say this. Cheating has nothing to do with looks, so it's worthless to comment on. Some of the most beautiful celebrities have had their partners caught up in cheating scandals. Whether some random dude on YouTube thinks Heather is attractive or not is meaningless because David Temple clearly did, and he wasn't the only one. David had a friend named Quentin at the school. Quentin was also married, and he happened to be married to Tammy, Belinda's friend. In fact, Quentin and Tammy were very good friends with David and Belinda up until the fall of 1998. At that point, Quentin and David were still fine, but Tammy started pulling away from her friendship with Belinda. The main reason was that Belinda and David's marriage issues were bleeding over into Tammy and Quentin's relationship. One issue was that Quentin and David would go out together, and Quentin would tell Tammy if they were out at a bar. But David maybe told a cover story to Belinda so she wouldn't think he was just out partying. But then Tammy would talk to Belinda, make a comment about them being at the bar, and then Belinda would be mad at David, and David would tell Quentin to get Tammy under control, and that put Quentin and Tammy on opposite sides of an issue that wasn't even theirs. Tammy felt the only way to focus on her own marriage was to stop being as much of a confidant for Belinda. But let's get back to Heather. She was at first trying to make friends with her coworkers, and soon ended up in flirtatious relationships with both David and Quentin. For Quentin, it seems like this may have been his first time dipping his toe into something like this, but it wasn't for David. There had been rumors that he cheated on Belinda before this, but only one time seems to have been backed up by any witness, and that is Quentin. David had his 10-year high school reunion over the summer of 1998, and he took Belinda to the main dinner event. But the night before that, there was a less formal get-together, and he went to that alone. According to what Quentin said, David met up with his old high school girlfriend, and when Quentin asked him if he slept with her, David's response was that they did everything but that. So, Heather was not David's first interest outside of his marriage. As far as setting a timeline for this relationship, according to an email David sent to Heather, he was interested in her since the first day of school. It was by late October of 1998 that people had noticed that they would pair off at these after-work happy hours. Though it doesn't seem like Belinda suspected anything at first, she did know something was going on. She told those close to her that David didn't seem as excited about the pregnancy anymore. Their reconciliation had only really lasted a couple of months at most, and then he started criticizing her again, telling her she was getting fat when she was literally pregnant. The more David wanted to spend his time with Heather, the less kind he was to Belinda within their home. It's not clear when David and Heather's flirting jumped over into an intimate physical relationship. Both would lie about the nature of their relationship later on, so it's hard to know if either one of them ever told the actual truth. According to Quentin, he and David had talked about their respective relationships with Heather. They both knew Heather was talking to and flirting with both of them. And David asked Quentin what his intentions were. Quentin said he didn't know. So David asked if he would leave Tammy for Heather, and Quentin said no. He then turned the question back on David. Would he leave his wife for Heather? And David said he wasn't sure. We do know that David and Heather were together for sure by December of 1998 when David bought Heather a gold necklace for Christmas. According to Belinda's friends, he didn't buy Belinda anything since they decided to not exchange gifts that year so that they could focus on their son and also save money for baby items. Belinda was approaching her 8th month of pregnancy at that point, so they needed to get serious about making sure they had everything. David would later say that he actually did buy Belinda a gift, a purse, but that doesn't negate the fact that he bought his girlfriend jewelry while his pregnant wife was trying to save money for their baby. Another issue that Christmas was that Belinda wanted her twin sister Brenda to come and visit them for the holiday, but David said no. He insisted that they instead spend their holidays with his family and his family alone as usual, so Belinda called Brenda and asked if she could come after Christmas instead. Their 30th birthday was on December 30th, so it would be great if she could come and stay so that they could celebrate their birthday together. Brenda was living in another state at the time, so she flew to Texas on December 27th, and she sensed that things were tense between Belinda and David from the jump. She said David made comments about how Belinda's butt was getting big, and she noticed that Belinda didn't really push back. Brenda told Belinda when they were alone that she needed to start standing up for herself and put her foot down when David would make fun of her or treat her poorly. And this certainly wasn't the first time Belinda had heard something like this. Other friends, particularly Tammy, had told her the same thing. On Brenda and Belinda's birthday, David announced that he was going to leave the next day to go hunting for the weekend. Brenda said that Belinda seemed surprised and hurt that he wasn't going to spend New Year's Eve with her and Evan, and that he was going to go hunting when she was so far along in her pregnancy. But he had his hunting gear all loaded up in his truck, and in the event there was some sort of emergency, he took Belinda's cell phone with him so she could at least reach him.
Breaking news, corporate tax is here. Starting from June 1st, there are 3 things every business, even free zone companies, must do to comply with the UAE's new corporate tax law. Get tax ready at taxready.ae, an initiative by Virtue Zone.
When you're in winter's favorite town, the snow-covered mountains surround you. A historic Main Street charms you. And every day brings a new adventure. Welcome to Park City, Utah. Naturally, winter's favorite town. Join the experience at visitparkcity.com.
On December 31st, David left for his hunting trip, and he drove 15 minutes away to Heather Scott's townhouse. He spent that night at a New Year's Eve party with her, and then he slept there for the next 2 nights. And as he was lying in bed with his girlfriend, his nearly 8-month pregnant wife had to wake up very early on January 1st, get her toddler up and into the car, and drive Brenda to the airport to catch her flight. According to phone records, David only called Belinda once while he was gone, and that was on January 2nd to let her know that he was on his way back from his hunting trip. When David got home, he took Belinda and Evan out to dinner, where friends saw them and reported Belinda and David barely spoke to each other, and Belinda looked very sad. And I don't blame her. Even if Belinda believed David had gone hunting that weekend like he said, his actions sent a message that he didn't really care about her feelings or the imposition his extracurricular activities were placing on her. He didn't even call to check on her or their son. With the new year and the school break having ended, both Belinda and David were back teaching and Evan was back in daycare, when on the night of January 10th, going into the 11th, 1999, Evan had a rough night. He had woken up because he didn't feel well and he was running a slight fever. The fever was below the daycare's limit for excluding kids, so Belinda just gave him some Motrin and dropped him off. She did tell them that Evan was not feeling 100%, and if his fever went up, to go ahead and call her, which they did at 11:40 that morning. Belinda had a lot to do that day at work, including a parent-teacher meeting after school hours, so she called David to see if he could go get Evan. He didn't answer his phone at the school, so she headed to pick Evan up while still trying to get in touch with David over the phone. She called him around 6 times total before she finally reached him, and by that point, she was already home with Evan and had gotten him down for a nap. So David headed home so Belinda could then head back to work. Around 3:20, Belinda finished up her after-school meeting and headed home, stopping at her in-laws' house first to pick up some homemade soup that David's mother had made. At 3:32, Belinda called David and let him know she was on her way home. David initially said that she got home at 3:45, but later would say it was actually closer to 4 p.m. And of course, the difference between those 15 minutes will come up later. This is going to be one of those timeline cases. When Belinda got home, David said she was tired, so she decided to go lie down. David said Evan was feeling better after his nap, so while Belinda relaxed, he was going to take Evan to the park and then run some errands before dinner. While David was gone, Belinda's sister Brenda called, and David's parents also called to see how Evan was feeling, and no one answered. The first phone call that was not answered was placed at 4:38 p.m. Not long after 5:30, Belinda and David's neighbors heard a knock on their door. It was more like a pounding or a banging on their door, and the husband, Mike, heard David say, "Mike, open the door." He opened it to find David standing there holding Evan. David just handed Evan over to Mike and said someone broke in. He told Mike and his wife Peggy to call 911, and then he ran back to his house. Mike turned around and handed Evan to Peggy and told her to call 911, and he ran after David. David did not look back and entered the yard through the back gate, and he either shut it behind him or just swung shut on its own. This was a problem because when Mike got to the gate and tried to open it, the Temple's dog, a chow mix named Shaka, basically charged at him. Shaka was known to be very protective and territorial and not at all friendly to people outside of the home. She would bark and growl at anyone who got near, and there's a story that went around the neighborhood that she actually attacked someone's lab. The lab was not seriously hurt, but I do bring it up to illustrate why there was no way Mike was going into that backyard with Shaka. Mike tried to shut the gate to keep Shaka in the yard, but Shaka kept butting up against the gate trying to open it. While Mike and Shaka were fighting over the gate, 2 911 calls came in within about 2 minutes of each other. One was from Peggy, who called to report the break-in like David told her to, and the other was from David. David had suspected a break-in because a pane of glass on the back door was smashed and the door was slightly open. So he had gotten Evan to safety, and then he ran in to look for Belinda and possibly confront an intruder. He made it up to their bedroom where he found his 30-year-old wife, Belinda Temple, on the floor of the closet, and there was blood everywhere. When David called 911 and told them what happened, he mentioned that she was 7 or 8 months pregnant, and the dispatcher asked him to do CPR for the sake of trying to save the baby. But David said he couldn't do it, and he does sound pretty distraught in this call. Some criticism may be that he could have at least tried CPR, but I personally don't think he was saying he couldn't do it, meaning he couldn't bring himself to do it. To be blunt about it, Belinda had been shot in the back of the head at close range with a 12-gauge shotgun. Based on the description of her injuries that I read, I think he meant he couldn't do it because of the amount of damage to her face and her head that he noticed when he tried to roll her over. While David was in the house calling 911, Peggy left little Evan to play with her 12-year-old son and went over to find Mike still outside the gate, trying to keep Shaka from opening it. Peggy had her phone in her hand, so she and Mike tried to call David in the house to figure out what was going on, but he didn't answer. Peggy then held the gate and tried to calm Shaka down since she was more familiar to Shaka, and it worked a bit, but not well enough for her to open the gate and go into the house. Mike ran to the front door to try to get in that way, but it was locked. At 5:49 p.m., about 10 minutes after David's 911 call, the first police officers arrived at the scene. They, too, tried to enter the yard, but if Shaka was wound up because of some neighbors, imagine the response to 2 police officers. The officers had a report of a break-in and someone being injured inside, so they had to get in there. They didn't know if Shaka was an all-bark, no-bite dog, but based on the neighbors being wary of her, they certainly weren't optimistic. The officers decided they had to enter the yard to get into the house, and if Shaka didn't back off, they were going to have to shoot her. Right as they were about to open the gate, David came out of the house, and they told him to secure the dog. Thankfully, he had time to put Shaka in the garage where she was safe and everyone else was safe. David then told them that his wife was dead and directed them to where they could find her. As they approached that back door, they saw what David said tipped him off that something was wrong. The window pane had been smashed. Then they made their way upstairs and found Belinda dead in the closet. It was far too late to save her or the baby, so the homicide detectives were called in. Outside the house, Evan was oblivious to everything happening while he played at the neighbor's house, and David was asked to sit in a patrol car, not because he was being detained, but just because he, Mike, and Peggy were all witnesses, and it's protocol to separate them until an officer can speak to them individually. When David asked how long he had to sit in the car, he was told it was until they could get his statement. And David seemed a little confused on why he would need to give a statement. The officer characterized this as David being agitated. He was told he might need to tell them about Belinda's activities that day. And that is what they wanted initially. Around 8:30 that evening, while they were still processing the scene, David was driven to the satellite office for the homicide squad, and because this was not the main station, unfortunately, the statement was not recorded. David was read his rights, though he was not being detained, and he was told he was free to leave at any point. David waived his right to remain silent and his right to have an attorney present while he talked to the investigators. David said that Belinda got home at 3:45 and she was very tired, which is understandable given how far into her pregnancy she was. She went to lay down while he took Evan, who was feeling better, to the park. David said they went to Peckham Park, which is about 15 minutes from their home. And then Evan said he was thirsty, so the two stopped at a grocery store near the park to get a drink, and while they were there, he picked up cat food. This was verified with security footage. They appeared on camera at 4:32 p.m. and left at 4:38 with drinks and cat food, just like David said. David said that they then headed home because he wanted to be there in time to have dinner with Belinda. He knew she planned to go play bunco that night with friends. Bunco is like a group dice game, and so they were going to eat on the earlier side. While he was driving home, David decided to swing by the Home Depot. They had been hanging shelves up in the nursery, and they bought the wrong shelving brackets that weekend, so that's why he was stopping there. Again, this was confirmed with CCTV, and the two entered the store around 5:14 p.m. They apparently left in a way that was not covered by a security camera, so we do not have a time for when they left the Home Depot. But David said they drove straight from the Home Depot to their house, arriving around 5:30, if not a few minutes later. David said he was going to let Evan ride his bike, so he got him out of his car seat and left him in the detached garage while he went to the back door to call in to Belinda that they were home before he then went back to supervising Evan. He saw the broken window and the door slightly ajar, so he ran to get Evan to the neighbor's house safely before he went back to see what was going on and to check on Belinda. When he found Belinda in the closet, David said she was curled up in a ball, and he pulled her legs straight to lay her flat and then realized how injured she was. That's when he called 911. So that brings us to the first responders getting to the scene. So let's go ahead and take some time to go through the crime scene and linger a bit on the parts that started making the police suspicious of this intruder theory. All of this comes from legal documents that will be listed in my sources. I usually put these types of documents towards the top of the sources list so they're easier to find. Starting with the garage, both Belinda's vehicle and David's truck were parked side by side. And inside Belinda's vehicle was a Home Depot bag that had the wrong-sized shelf brackets and the receipt for them. So the odd things with this is, number one, David was heading to run errands, including Home Depot, but he didn't grab the thing they were supposed to return. But maybe the Home Depot stop was enough of a spur-of-the-moment decision that he hadn't thought to grab the bag ahead of time. But then the investigators looked in David's truck. They saw the things you would expect from someone who just came home. There was the bag of cat food he bought, his wallet, and his jacket. But what wasn't in there was a car seat. Evan's car seat was actually in Belinda's car. Those who knew the family would say that Evan never rode without being buckled into his car seat, and they would have expected David to move the car seat into his truck. So the investigators wondered, why didn't David take the time to move the car seat over? David had also said Evan was in his car seat, so this wasn't adding up. Also in the garage were pet food dishes with fresh dog food in one, water in the other, and then there was a bit of a sleeping area set up. I do want to note this because something that came up very early on and continues to get reported is Shaka. How could an intruder or a burglar have gotten through the backyard to the back door when even the neighbors who Shaka knew couldn't get past her? This garage setup was David's explanation for it. He said he left the dog not in the yard, but in the garage while he and Evan were out. So, crossing the yard to that back door. That door is the exact style of the ones they always show in commercials for alarm systems. It was a single pane of glass, but it had the trim to make it look like 9 smaller panes. The rectangle of glass closest to the doorknob was smashed through. Being that this was tempered glass, some type of tool would have had to been used to break it. But we've all seen the commercials. They break that pane of glass, reach in, and unlock the door. When the investigators looked at where the shards of glass had fallen, it was on the inside of the house, indicating the window was broken from the outside, but the location of the glass didn't make sense. There was no glass on either side of the threshold, and none on the couch directly in front of the door. The majority of the glass was to the left of the door, which is the direction the door swung open. So you might think the glass broke right in front of the door was opened, pushing the glass to the left. However, the farthest piece of glass found had landed 13 feet away. If the door was closed when the glass was smashed, and it was hit hard enough for a piece to fly 13 feet away, why didn't any get on the couch in front of the door? Why was it all flying off to the left? This indicated to the police that the door was partially opened when the glass was broken. And what type of burglar breaks the glass when the door is already open? So sticking to this walkthrough of the scene, in that same area over in the living room, they saw that the television was off of its stand and it was on the floor. For those of you too young to remember, which honestly wouldn't be very many of you based on my demographics, but we're talking the late 1990s, so this was a bulky television. It was not a flat screen. And this one weighed about 50 pounds. It would have been unwieldy to carry out. So at first glance, it looked like the intruder was going to take the TV with them, but then couldn't manage it. There was a scratch on the TV stand and splinters on the ground, showing fresh damage of when whoever it was tried to get the TV off that stand. But the TV was still plugged in, both to the power and to the cable outlet. So you would think that if someone was going to steal this, they would have unplugged it first. The police also said that when they turned on the TV, it worked fine and didn't seem to have any damage as though it had been dropped. They thought it looked more like it had been lowered to the ground. Now, the other side of this is that later this same month, that television was brought into a repair shop, and the man who fixed it said the damage was consistent with the TV being dropped. And this one is hard to say because we don't have a chain of custody on this television. It was still in the house when the house was released back to the family. So sure, it could have been dropped on the day of the murder, but it also could have been dropped in the following week or two. We just don't know. Continuing our walkthrough, in the same area of the house were drawers and a buffet that were open, but nothing had been dumped, and the china cabinet in the dining room had been left untouched. Belinda's purse was also in the house. It was found in a downstairs closet, and it appeared to be undisturbed. But it was in a closet, so it's possible nobody saw it. Her car keys, though, were in plain sight. They were on a step on the staircase, so this robber did not apparently try to steal her vehicle. David said that the stairs and the closet were where she normally put her car keys and her purse, but others have said this isn't true. They said that Belinda usually put those items on the kitchen counter, so them being found elsewhere seemed odd. Now, continuing up the stairs, as the investigators entered David and Belinda's bedroom, they saw that there was a jewelry box on one dresser in plain sight that contained Belinda's jewelry. To them, it looked like it was untouched. On the other dresser, there was a tray with David's items like his watch and his wedding ring, and those were all there. However, it is possible an intruder would not have seen this tray because it was somewhat blocked from the door by the television.
When you're in winter's favorite town, the snow-covered mountains surround you. A historic Main Street charms you. And every day brings a new adventure. Welcome to Park City, Utah. Naturally, winter's favorite town. Join the experience at visitparkcity.com.
Good sleep should come naturally, and with the new Natural Hybrid mattress, it can. A collaboration between Lisa and West Elm, the Natural Hybrid is expertly crafted from natural latex, natural wool, and certified safe foams to elevate your sleep sanctuary and support a greener tomorrow. Breathable organic cotton and moisture-wicking Joma wool consistently provide cool and comfortable slumber. Every purchase helps fuel Lisa's work with shelters and those in need. Visit lisa.com to learn more. That's LEESA.com.
David would file a claim to his insurance company stating that multiple items were taken, including 3 pairs of earrings, 2 necklaces, and 2 watches. All of these were items that belonged to Belinda. This, however, was not directly reported to the police. They heard about it through the media, and then they asked David for a list of the stolen items. An inventory list of about 10 things would be sent to the police, who then sent that off to local pawn shops, but nothing was ever found. Nothing of David's was taken from the house, and the jewelry Belinda was wearing when she was killed also wasn't taken. But the investigators wouldn't learn that there was an accusation that anything was taken at all for at least a week. So at the time they're at the crime scene investigating, they see no evidence of a robbery. It's almost like the idea is someone went through the jewelry box and picked a few things they wanted, but that doesn't really make sense with the nature of the crime. This was broad daylight when a robber would have every reason in the world to believe that someone, like David, might come home at any time. It would also have been reasonable of them to expect the neighbors heard a shotgun blast and the police might be on the way. So you would expect that someone would ransack the home or grab the whole jewelry box and just run. But they didn't. And now, with us being in the bedroom portion of the crime scene, we do have to get to that closet. That is where they found Belinda's body. And I noticed something immediately in the photos that have been released. These photos do have her head and face blurred, but her legs aren't, and more specifically, her feet aren't. Belinda was wearing shoes. I've read that Belinda was the type to take her shoes off at the door, but even if she wasn't, I don't know anyone who climbs into bed with their shoes on. And beyond that, it was noted that her eyeglasses were in the closet as well, and who wears their glasses to take a nap? David would later say that Belinda went to lie down and read a magazine, not sleep, which maybe accounts for the glasses, but really the shoes she wore out and about that day? I'll confess that I am pretty much a slob, and even I don't do that. As for how Belinda got into the closet, there are two theories to that. From the blood, they know that it was where she was shot. She wasn't moved there. So one theory is that she was forced in there at gunpoint. The blood spatter was lower. It was on the bottom half of the closet, so it's believed that she was shot in the back of the head while kneeling. That would also explain the somewhat curled up position David found her in. But also in the closet was a cordless phone. It was the one from her bedroom, and it was near her hand. So that's the other theory. Belinda grabbed the phone as she ran into the closet to hide and to try to call 911, but the killer caught up to her before she could do that. The murder weapon was determined to be a 12-gauge shotgun based on the pellets and the wadding found at the scene. And though there were 2 rifles found in the closet with Belinda, there was no shotgun in the house. I think it's clear why the crime scene did not match the assumptions made that this was a robbery gone wrong. Whoever did this was there to kill Belinda, and everything else, like putting the TV on the floor and opening the drawers, was just a diversion. So the next step in this investigation was to verify David's alibi, and the security cameras certainly helped. But the problem was there were some gaps. The initial timeline they were working with put Belinda at home at 3:45 and David leaving soon after. David later pushed this out to 4 p.m., but that's not what he initially said, so that's not what the investigators were considering at this time. There was another change in David's story, with him first saying that he took Evan to this park that was 15 minutes away. He then told another investigator that they actually didn't end up going to the park because Evan got thirsty and they went straight to the store. And then later there would be another story about how they actually went to the neighborhood park and not Peckham Park 15 minutes away. But the problem is only Peckham Park makes sense in the timeline. If they skipped the park entirely, they should have been to the grocery store by 4 p.m. if they left at 3:45. Even if we push it to the later timeline of 4 o'clock, that still gives him until 4:15. But they didn't walk into the store until 4:32. So now let's say instead they did go to the neighborhood park for 15 or 30 minutes and Evan got thirsty, so they drove to the grocery store. That would fit the timeline, but it doesn't really make sense. There were other stores much closer to go pick up a drink, and he was actually closer to his own house than he was this grocery store. We know how much investigators just love changing stories, so this is raising some red flags. But they were also wondering why David would have taken Evan to the park at all. He said it was so Belinda could rest, but Evan had just had a fever 4 hours before this. He was sick enough that the daycare sent him home. With how protective Belinda and David were, it was surprising to some people that either one of them would have thought, okay, let's take him to the park and to run some errands when he had just been sick. But let's go ahead and get back to the timeline. Regardless of whether they stopped at a park first or not, they left the grocery store at 4:38, and according to David, they went straight to the Home Depot, arriving there at 5:14. I've mapped this on Google Maps at various times of the day, and it would have been about a 15-minute drive, but it took David 36 minutes to get there. David said this was because of traffic, but a witness came forward to say David may not have been where he said he was. This witness was a man named Buck, and he was driving at around 4:50 or 5 o'clock in the area near where David's parents lived. He knew David from high school, and he said he recognized David behind the wheel of a truck that was passing him. This sighting was deemed credible because he both knew David and he was able to describe what his truck looked like to the police with detail. According to my Google mapping, the area where he saw David is about 3 miles north of the grocery store, and it's in the wrong direction for someone heading to the Home Depot. The reason this is relevant to the police is that there are rice fields up in that area, as well as lots of trees, and these are the types of places you could go to get rid of evidence if that is what you were looking to do. When asked about this, though, David stuck to his story that he was not in that area and Buck couldn't have seen him there. But he still didn't have a really good explanation for it taking so long to get to these various places on his timeline other than to say traffic. And of course, the question of why he couldn't remember which park they went to if they went to any park at all. The detective conducting the interview where they confronted David about these inconsistencies said that David was getting irritated. And I know some people really do see it as valuable to know if the person being questioned is reacting positively or negatively, but to me, this is just evidence of how they're reacting. It's not evidence to why they're reacting. Innocent or guilty, people do get irritated when they're being grilled by the police. David left this particular interview knowing he was a suspect in Belinda's murder and in the resulting death of his daughter because they pretty much just told him he was a suspect. And he would be unless he could clear up the inconsistencies in his timeline and his story. So David stopped speaking directly with the police and instead had all communications go through his attorney. The investigators did hope that there would be witnesses in the neighborhood who might have some insights into the timeline. This was the part of the day when kids were coming home from school and parents were getting back from work, so people were in and out. They hoped someone had seen something or heard something. We do have Mike and Peggy, who lived across the street. Mike had walked one of his kids' friends home around 4 p.m., didn't see anything suspicious, and then he and Peggy went for a walk from 4:20 until about 5 o'clock. They said they saw a car speeding through the neighborhood around 4:35 with teenagers inside. It was only notable in hindsight of something bad happening in the neighborhood, but it seemed at the time just to be typical teens driving. The timing of these teens driving through the neighborhood fit into another early piece of the timeline. There were 3 brothers who lived behind the Temple family home, and they had gone off the school bus at 3:57. They went inside, they had a snack, and then they started watching a movie they rented, Dr. Dolittle. While watching this movie, they heard a boom. All 3 of them heard it. And at first they thought it was a firework, but then it occurred to them it may have been a gunshot. The oldest of the 3 thought he remembered where in the movie the boom had happened. We do have 2 caveats here before we get into it. 1, he was an elementary school-aged child, and 2, he was being asked about the timing of this boom 4 days after the murder. So we're talking about a young child thinking back 4 days. But it was better than nothing. So the investigators tried to rebuild the timeline by estimating what time he said they started the movie and then figuring out how far into the film they would have been when this noise happened. This put the estimated time of the boom as no earlier than 4:30. which would fit with Mike and Peggy seeing this car speed through about 5 minutes later. The problem, for anyone who thinks David Temple is guilty, is that he had a solid alibi for this time. He and Evan were at the grocery store that was at least 13 to 15 minutes away at 4:32, and they were on security camera. David could absolutely prove he was there. He could not have been in the neighborhood when the kids heard the boom. And then when you add in the car of teenagers zipping through the neighborhood 5 minutes later, it seems like a reasonable alternative theory was developing. The medical examiner was not able to help here because he could not narrow down the time of death to say whether Belinda was killed closer to 3:45 or 4 o'clock, which was before David left the house, or if it was more like 4:30 or 5 or later, which is when David had a rock-solid alibi. It's not surprising that the ME could not be more specific. Estimating time of death usually comes down to a window of hours, not minutes. But if there could be one magical thing we take from CSI TV world into real world, pinpointing time of death so specifically would be a game changer in investigations, but it's not reality. The investigators only found one other witness who heard a boom in the neighborhood that day, and it was a neighbor who was outside and saw a truck backfire between 4:30 and 5 p.m. He didn't just hear it backfire, he saw it as well. So it was possible that that's the sound the boys heard and it was not a shotgun blast. This neighbor was consistent with the police every time he talked to them that he saw this truck backfire. But there is some indication that he told the media something else, that he characterized the noise as possibly being from a shotgun. But this is all they had as far as these ear witnesses go. They had a child trying to remember something from 4 days before, and someone who said he saw a truck backfire but also indicated maybe it was a shotgun. The investigators did have another witness come forward as they canvassed the neighborhood. A woman named Angela was walking through when she saw David pull into his driveway right in front of her. She saw David in the truck and Evan was not in his car seat. It stood out to her because he was small enough that he should have been in a seat. Angela put the time at 5:25, which would have meant David was home for 5 to 8 minutes longer than he said before running to the neighbor's house. But Angela could be off on her time. David and Evan entered the Home Depot at 5:14, but we don't know what time they left. It does take 13 minutes to get from the Home Depot to their house, according to Google Maps. So for him to have gotten there as early as 5:25, he and Evan would have had to enter the Home Depot and almost immediately leave. The investigators also had a number of other potential witnesses who were out and about in the neighborhood at various times, but they didn't really witness anything. No one saw anything suspicious, nobody saw someone walking through with a shotgun, and no one heard Shaka, the Temple's dog, bark. The only people who witnessed a dog barking was a neighbor who said their dog was barking along the fence line that they shared with the Temples around 4:20 or 4:30. Shaka not barking stood out to people. David said he put her in the garage, but as the police were at the house on the night of the murder, Shaka being in the garage did nothing to stop her from barking. And Belinda's family said that the bedding and the animal bowls that were in the garage weren't actually Shaka's. They were there for Belinda's cat, who had mostly become an outdoor cat. Angela, the witness who saw David pull into the garage, she said she didn't hear or see Shaka either. Though, in all fairness, she also didn't see Belinda's car in the garage from her angle, so maybe Shaka was there but just out of sight. And I have to say, people didn't hear a 12-gauge shotgun blast even though we know it happened. So maybe they could have just not heard the dog barking, even though she was. You know me, I like to give both sides of things, which is why this is turning into a two-parter. But we're not at the break just yet because we have to talk about the next major lead, and that, of course, was the affair. It was almost immediately after word got out that Belinda had been killed that an officer with the school district called the investigators to let them know the worst kept secret at the school, and that was that David Temple was having an affair with another teacher named Heather Scott. David had not volunteered this information to the police. When the investigators interviewed Heather Scott for the first time on January 12th, 1999, the day after the murder, she absolutely downplayed their relationship. She admitted it was romantic for about 3 months leading up to Belinda's murder, but she said they only saw each other once a week at the after-work happy hour, and maybe sometimes he'd come over to her apartment and watch a movie, but that was it. She said that on January 5th, days before Belinda's murder, they did have a conversation about ending whatever their relationship was since he was married, but she left out that the relationship had been physically intimate. Heather lived with a roommate, Tara, who was also interviewed, and she was very vague about what she knew. But a few days later, after speaking with a friend who happened to be an attorney, Tara decided it was in her best interest to be more forthcoming to the police. Tara told them that Heather and David had been intimate, and that a few days after Heather said that they shouldn't be seeing each other anymore because he was married, David told Heather that he was falling in love with her. And Heather let him know that the feeling was mutual. Tara was telling the investigators that this romantic relationship was not quite as casual as Heather had described. And in speaking with Heather again, it seems like she had also reconsidered how vague to be with the police, and she was much more open to speaking to them frankly in her second statement. She admitted that she and David had spent that New Year's weekend together, and that David returned to his family on January 2nd. 3 days later, on the 5th, she said they should end things because they really shouldn't be in this relationship when he's married. And then 3 days after that, on January 8th, David told Heather he was falling in love with her. And then the investigators noted that it was 3 days after that that Belinda was murdered. But Heather said there was absolutely no way David had killed Belinda. Even though she said they should end their relationship since he was married and they confessed feelings for each other, the conversation never really went anywhere. It didn't go past that. There was no discussion of David getting out of his marriage through divorce or any other means so that they could be together. None of that was happening. And with Heather having spoken to the police, David had to have realized that the word of his affair was going to get out, but he was still hesitant to admit it even to his own family. His father and his brothers sat him down 2 days after Belinda's death and asked him if there was anything they needed to know. He first said no, but then he admitted to having an affair. Obviously, David's family was upset about this. There is no doubt in my mind that David's family really loved Belinda, and this left them disappointed in David. They were hurt on Belinda's behalf, but also they had to know how this looked. David was a suspect in her murder, and now this was a motive. He certainly was not going to come across as a loving husband who was eagerly awaiting the birth of his daughter. Later, David's friend Quentin would come forward and tell the police that the same day David confessed his affair to his parents, which was 2 days after his wife's death, he asked Quentin how Heather was doing. Then not long after the funeral, days later, David called Quentin and asked him to tell Heather that he was sorry she was having to go through this, meaning, I assume, the police scrutiny. As for direct contact with Heather, we know they were back in contact by January 25th, 2 weeks after Belinda's murder. David sent Heather an email on the 26th saying that he hoped her day was going well, and she replied that it was better now that she heard from him, and he wrote back that it made him feel better to have seen her the day before. It either dawned on Heather that the police would do a digital search, or she was tipped off that the police were getting ready to get a subpoena, because she then emailed David to tell him to make sure he deleted everything, both in his deleted folder and his sent box. David did as she suggested, and the emails between David and Heather were off of their work computers when the subpoena came through 2 days later. What they did not anticipate, though, was that there were backups of many of these emails on the school's main system. Yes, they were emailing back and forth during the school day from their official school computers. While the investigators couldn't recover every email, they got a lot of them. And that included the email of Heather telling David to delete everything. It was clear through these emails that the relationship had started heating up sometime in October. Though Heather said they only had sex a few times, based on the number of times her roommate Tara said that the two would go into Heather's room and close the door for hours, this may not be the truth. David would later say that he and Heather did not resume their relationship for several months, upwards of a year after Belinda's murder, but that was not true according to other witnesses. Heather's roommate Tara said that on Valentine's Day, a month after the murder, David sent Heather a big bouquet of flowers. Other times she would come home and see his truck parked around the corner a little out of the way. The staff at Evan's daycare would notice a blonde woman sitting in David's truck when he would pick Evan up. In March or April, David was helping Heather with spring flower beds at the townhouse. They seemed to be spending a lot of time together for people who were not actually together. A few weeks after Belinda's funeral, David went out to lunch with his friend Quentin, and he was complaining about the way he had been treated by the investigators. Quentin asked David why he didn't just talk to them and clear everything up, and David said his attorney told him not to. Quentin voiced what a lot of innocent and frankly naive people think. Don't you want to cooperate so that you can find out who did this? The truth is, if the police have told you you were a suspect, talking to them is rarely going to be in your best interest. But instead of giving that answer, David said, according to Quentin, what difference will it make? It won't bring her back. The lack of interest in finding justice for Belinda and for baby Aaron struck Quentin as odd. Maybe even suspicious, but this was one of his best friends who Quentin believed had an alibi. So he was sticking with David and supporting him. Quentin was not the only one David expressed this sentiment to. Belinda's sister Brenda called him here and there, and one time she asked him, doesn't he want the murder solved? And David said, again, what difference would it make? And then said that Belinda would not want all of this. She would want them to leave it alone. I don't know Belinda Temple, and I do not want to speak for her. What I do know is being a parent. Even if Belinda wouldn't care about justice for herself, I can't imagine a world where she wouldn't want it for her baby who didn't have a chance. The full truth of this situation isn't that David wasn't cooperating with the police. It's that he was not talking to them directly, but there was a sharing of information that would be sent through his attorney. And it was through one of these communications that the Temple family offered up an alternative suspect. Belinda had trouble with one of her students who happened to live right next door. This student was a 16-year-old named Joe, and he was, I am sure, the apple of his parents' eye, but also the source of all of their gray hair. The reason he was involved with Belinda at school was that she worked directly with students who needed extra support and small group instruction and tutoring. And Joe fell into that category in large part due to his truancy issues. When faced with the decision between going to class or smoking pot with his friends, Joe made his choice. There had also been a few issues with Joe in the neighborhood, things like playing music too loudly and having a party when his parents weren't around, and beer cans ending up in the Temple's yard. Because Joe was one of Belinda's students, she knew about his issues at school, primarily that issue of not showing up. She had him every other day, and he was missing a lot of instructional time. Belinda knew that he was at risk of being transferred to the alternative school over this to try to get him caught up so that he could graduate. So, as a neighbor and as a teacher, Belinda went to talk to his parents at his house while he was there. After she let them know what was going on, they grounded Joe in the hopes that some type of consequence would get him to stop skipping class so much. It didn't really do much good, and Joe carried on as he had. But this was someone in the neighborhood who may have had a grudge against Belinda for getting him into trouble with his parents. The police then learned that over Christmas time, so less than a month before the murder, Joe had friends over and they knocked over some of Belinda and David's outside Christmas decorations. That sounded like the sort of thing a teen would do in retaliation, but would he do worse than that? Joe was interviewed about what he did on the day of the murder, and he said he went to school, which was partially true. He did go to school, he just didn't stay there. He skipped out early with his friend Cody. One reason Joe may have been hesitant to admit what he was really doing that day was because what he was doing wasn't exactly on the right side of the law. Joe admitted that he and Cody went to his house to get a joint and then they drove around while smoking. Around 2:45, Joe dropped Cody off at his house and then went to his friend Ryan's place for a bit before he then went home at 3:30. He called another friend, Michael, and he and Cody both came over to Joe's house. The three then decided to go out and do what else but buy more weed since Joe was out, so they went to another house in the neighborhood to do that. That friend either didn't have any weed or Joe and his friends didn't have enough money, I'm not sure which, so they left without a joint, but they did go and buy some cigarettes at the convenience store instead, getting back to Joe's house around 4:30. His friends soon left, and the vehicle they were in matched the description of the one Mike and Peggy said sped by, so these movements may explain that. Joe said he then laid down on the sofa and fell asleep. He didn't wake up until his dad came home from work around 6 and woke him up telling him that something had happened at the Temple house. Joe said he didn't see or hear anything suspicious, and he denied knowing anything about Belinda's murder. He also denied that he had a grudge against her. Her telling on him had not much impact on his life, and when it came to the Christmas decorations, he said that his friends had messed with them, and he was the one who told them to put everything back. As for access to a shotgun, aka the murder weapon, Joe's family had 2 shotguns that he had access to, and they were taken in for testing. Neither had any blood on them, and the shells the family had for them were not the same type used to kill Belinda. The police then polygraphed Joe and his friends to varying success. Some failed and some were inconclusive. There were a few factors that influenced the results, and that reminds us why polygraphs are not admissible in court. The first was that Joe and his friends admittedly used drugs, and drugs impair our responses, and polygraphs only measure our responses. The other issue was that Joe and his friends received special education services at the high school. The questions asked may have been too complexly structured, causing them confusion, which would then increase anxiety, and the polygraph would register that response. The police then had a teacher go over the questions and simplify them to language the teens would understand, but by that point, Joe had taken and failed 3 polygraphs. His parents would not let him take any more. In talking to the neighbors about Joe, they mostly said he wasn't really that much trouble. Aside from the loud music complaints, he was polite enough, and he was good with the younger kids in the neighborhood. His discipline issues were something the family dealt with, but they hadn't really spilled over into the neighborhood much. And a search of his school records showed kind of the same thing. He had some issues in school, some behavioral issues. He didn't follow the rules, but nothing they saw was violent. He wasn't getting into fights. He wasn't being aggressive. So the investigation into Joe and his friends sort of stalled out when they couldn't find hard evidence in one direction or the other. And that's kind of where it stood with David Temple as well. After all of this early evidence was gathered, it was presented to a grand jury in March and April of 1999. Various people who knew David and Belinda testified, including Quentin and Tammy. They said that David called them the evening after they testified to find out what they said. Tammy wouldn't tell him what she testified to, and when he talked to Quentin, Quentin just said that he told the truth. And David's reply was, "You need to keep your mouth shut." Later in April, according to Quentin, David again reiterated for him to keep his mouth shut, and there would be other accusations that David and/or members of his family actively tried to influence witnesses here, but we're going to get more into that in part 2. In the end, the 1999 grand jury did not lead to an indictment, and that is where we are going to leave things for now. In the next episode, we will get into the later stages of the investigation, the multiple legal proceedings in this case, and get caught all the way up to the most recent court action, which took place in April of 2023. And that part 2 will be out whenever I get it finished. It is time for September Patreon and Supercast birthday shoutouts. I love having these opportunities to give these shoutouts because not only is a thank you for your support, but also I love to celebrate birthdays. So I want to say a very happy birthday to Catherine, Becky, Viv, Isha, Julie, Tracy, Cassandra, Brandy, Luann, Paulina, Betsy, Lori, and Travis. I hope the next year is full of memories and adventures and also more time for us to chat on Patreon or Supercast, wherever you're subscribed. And cheers to each of you and happy birthday.